thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Lonnie from the library. I'm a youth services librarian at Velour Village. And today's presentation is going to be about tips and tricks about teaching your kids and teens about money. We're going to go through why they don't teach this in school explicitly, and we'll talk about some of the new revelations recently from the government. We'll talk about different epochs in a child's life, so 5 to 8, 8 to 12, 13 to 17, and 18 plus. I'll give you resources at the end of the presentation that you can look up via an email, and this will be archived on our YouTube channel. So let's begin. So for a long time, I was born in 1989, and I didn't learn a thing about money in school, other than it's this mysterious mythology around money. And of course, you go to work 9 to 5, ideally, and then you save as much as you can. You buy a house, you might have children, and then you retire in your 60s. And after staying at a workplace for years and years. Unfortunately, that's not exactly the way it has turned out for a lot of people, especially in the recent 20 years, and especially so in the last 10 since the 2008 crash. And as such, there's been a lot of fervor, especially in Canada and America for that matter, but why isn't this explicitly talked about school? And so one point to think about is school does a very good job of teaching us literacy for the most part. But some critiques about school and financial literacy specifically is a lot of people have talked about how school is essentially creating workers rather than investors or entrepreneurs. School is set up such that it is creating people who are good at going to work, following rules, producing an income, and then going home for the rest of the day. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what I do for a profession. However, if to really understand the intricacies of money and financial literacy, it's just not enough. Now, luckily, in the last week, the Ontario government talked about how they will be starting teaching in grade 9, if I recall correctly, teaching students about mortgages and paying off debt. I think that's a great first step. Something to think about, however, is that teaching mortgage and paying off debt, that's only specifically talking about making the student understand that you have to buy something. You have to buy a house, a car, and pay it off. MasterCard debt, Visa debt. Instead, a more fulsome picture would be how to save money, how to allocate that money into various investment vehicles, whether that's stocks, bonds, real estate, or what have you. Talking about scholarships, and most importantly, talking about how to think about your relationship and satisfaction between money as a tool rather than money as a get-all. And so it's a great improvement, but that's still not a fulsome picture that we would like. So what I'm really going to talk about in this is we need that wholesome picture, the spending, saving, investing, real cost of living. That's part of financial literacy. Home ownership versus rent. There was a great podcast recently by the, it was the Rational Reminder podcast, the CPAs from Ottawa, and their latest episode went through the cost analysis benefit of ownership of house versus renting, which was really great. And then of course, taxes. And so all of these intricacies go beyond just learning about a mortgage and paying debt, because that's teaching our students how to be consumers rather than investors. Something to keep in mind, high school is free, and historically that changed in the Queen Victoria made it, at least in the British colonies and Britain. It was during Queen Victoria's reign that high school or elementary school became mandatory, and eventually high school became free. However, at least in Canada and America, college and university is not. In Germany, it is. One pretty poignant criticism of that is that it's too lucrative, because we run a lot of universities, colleges as businesses, it's too lucrative to make it free. And secondly, it does create class divisions in that it allows our society to become stratified a lot more easy than if everyone had access to that. Something to keep in mind. And then, so as a result, the Canadian government made, for example, the RESP, Registered Education Savings Plan, and to empower you, the parent, to preemptively take control of your child's prospects. So if university and college was free, you wouldn't need an RESP because it would be free. Since it's not, this is a very practical tool to use. And so let's get right into it. The first thing, with the Registered Education Savings Plan, it's a misnomer. It should really be called the Registered Education Investing Plan, because that's really its power, is that it's investing tax-free. So the first thing to do is when your child is born, you can even do it the day of, but I'm sure your partner will want you to be there when they're born. So do it a couple days after. A grandparent can open it for a child, the parent, anyone related. The rules for that are quite flexible, which is great. But most importantly, let's say you, the parent, open your RESP for your child. You are in control of it, and you can contribute up to $50,000 to their education. So this is, you should start this as soon as they're born. If you're in this talk right now, and let's say your child's 5 or 10, don't sweat it. You can open it tomorrow, and that's just as good. The best time to do anything was yesterday, and the second best is today. So as I said, you can contribute up to $50,000 per child. And what's really great about the RESP, you can see that the government really wants you to preemptively do this, because they'll match 20% of the first $2,500 each year. So that's $500 a year, for a total of $7,200 matching in total. So you could potentially have a book value of $57,200 in total, which is incredible. So that right there is $7,200 for free over the length of time. Now, importantly, in an RESP, that the money grows tax-free. It's similar to a RRSP in that it's free once it's in there, but once you take it out, it gets taxed, and we'll talk about that more in a second. Something to keep in mind too is just because your child or teenager, they eventually go to university or college around 18 or 20, you can continue contributing up to that $50,000 limit up until their age 31. Secondly, once you actually start taking out money, let's pretend your child goes to university at 18, and then every year for 4 years, they have to pay off their tuition. When you take out that amount, it's taxed at their marginal rate, at your child's marginal rate. And unless they have part-time work, which definitely I will advocate for later on, presumably their tax rate will be significantly lower than yours. So the tax implications of having an RESP completely outweigh not investing at all. Another thing to keep in mind, I won't go into real big detail about it here because you can look this up for a case-by-case basis. But if your child eventually doesn't end up going to college or university when the time comes, let's say they become an entrepreneur or they pivot in some other direction, there are other options to transfer the money in an RESP without the huge tax implications, whether that means transferring it to another child or to a spouse, or to that child with different tax implications. So something to keep in mind. And then lastly, and this is probably the most important thing that I'll hammer in today, is that you should use your RESP, their RESP, your child's RESP, as a tool to teach them how to save and invest. Because I put in buy-in stakes there on the last point, and that's because this will actually give your child at an early age a real buy-in on the habits of saving, putting off stuff, understanding what between wants and needs, and how the magic of compound investing can really work in their favor. If you recall from last month, if you joined, I gave a famous quote from Einstein rather, about the ninth wonder of the world is compound interest, just because of how much it can grow. And presumably, if your child goes to university at 18 or college, and you open an RESP at 0, they have 18 years of growth. So lots and lots of great things can happen between then. So here's a couple tips. We're going to go through each epoch of your child's life from, as you can see, early on. Some of these can be controversial. I wanted to include as much as possible. And most importantly, this is your child. This is a conversation for you and your partner to have. This is a conversation for you as your child gets older to have with your child and really include them in this process. So please take what works best for you. and go from there. So the first thing to keep in mind about money is that kids emulate parents in every way. When people come, again, I'm a youth librarian, when people come and they'll come to story times and they'll ask me, how do I get my child to read more? Well, firstly, coming to the library is the best bet. Secondly, though, is if you take a priority of reading and your child sees you reading, they too will start understanding, my parent has allocated time and energy to this specific activity. Maybe there's some merit to it, and they too will emulate. Also, they just want to emulate you because you're their parent. So similarly, if you have a relationship with money where it's not stressful, or you are constantly teaching your spouse and you or talking about it in a positive light, your kid will start emulating that relationship with money. And especially, as I was talking about with your RESP, which we'll get into a little more, when you do it as a family, it becomes much more of a liberating activity rather than a stressful one when you're talking about money. So at the ages of 5 and 8, this is where number sense really comes into their pedagogical life. Number sense as in they learn addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, of course, but also from, again, I was born in 1989. So when I was in grade 2, that's when I learned about clock time. So I would have been 8 then. So we're talking 1997. Now, of course, things get slightly accelerated, but something to keep in mind is don't underestimate what your child can understand. I'm not talking about using the full numbers of how much you and your spouse make, not like that, but introducing concepts early, giving them hints that can really plant the seed for later development. So as an example, back in the Elizabethan era, 15-year-olds had the equivalent of a master's degree of today. And that's not because they were particularly smarter, but rather they dedicated a lot more time to these activities. And so similarly, with the number senses that your child will learn at this age between 5 and 8, don't underestimate the abilities that they can have and that you can cultivate with them. As I said, something that you'll want to come across over time is that you'll really want to foster a positive relationship with money as a tool rather than an end onto itself. So as an example, kids really pick up. I talked about language earlier, how they pick up on language and what you prioritize. If you're reading a lot, they tend to read a lot. If you're the type of language you use, they'll emulate the words you take. That's how they initially learn language. So similarly, the way you talk and have conversations about money will eventually influence your child's relationship with money too. Another thing to keep in mind is shifting money from happiness to time. So there, especially in North America, we have a consumer culture, which is good and bad. And part of the bad, however, is that a lot of people associate being happy with having the ability, not just to buy something fancy, shiny, or new, but showing it off to other people. And that's very much an external means of happiness versus what we want money to be is a metaphor for time within the child's life. And we'll go into some specific ideas of how to talk about that. But as an example right now is when I was a kid, my parents would be like, we just cooked this dinner. Guess how much your plate costs? Now, this doesn't make for the most compelling conversations day in and day out. But once in a while, they'll mention this and say, oh, it only costs us $5. Eat as you will. Then we would go to a restaurant and I would order and they say, oh, see, this one is $15. How much more is that compared to at home? I go, oh, it's 3 times as much. And that started solidifying these ideas to me in a very casual, again, not stressful way, an opportunity to learn rather than conversations of parents yelling about who's going to pay the next mortgage payment or you're running tight. And so shifting the conversations within the household can really help solidify ideas for your child. And so you see here, I have the birds and bees, and I'm not talking about that birds and bees. I'm talking about where does money come from? And this is really important. Again, you're at this age, especially, you're not telling your child how much you make. Instead, you can start talking about, well, mom and dad or 2 moms or what have you, we go to work and hopefully we like what we do. And at the end of every other week or once a month, we get paid to do that. And that's how I pay for all your things. And leaving the conversation at those macro ideas can really help have your child start connecting what's in front of them. So their clothes on their back, the food they eat, the toys they get to buy, or that you buy for them rather, and really solidifying the idea of this doesn't grow on trees, but rather your parents really earn it. And as I said before, don't underestimate what they can understand. You'd be very surprised of what they can understand. I'm not saying start talking about index funds and why a mutual fund is not as good as an index fund, yada, yada, but just general ideas of they're gonna learn a lot in these years, and this is a good time to plant those seeds. Another thing with the RESP is, and just everything in general, is if you think more of, instead of I'm the parent and I have the money and the child and I give them once in a while some money to buy something, or I take care of them, if you can start including them in some of these minor decisions. So as an example of what to eat for dinner, and not only what kind of taste you have that night, but what do you think we should do? How often should we eat out? And getting them into these conversations will start prepping them much earlier than when they're teenagers, or even worse, when they're off to university by themselves, of what is really responsible spending. And most importantly, it's fun. If you more people included, it becomes much more fun than a actual lesson, which is what we want to avoid. And so making everything, every big event or even minor events, a teachable moment. So I'm going to give you some examples here. So some teachable moments at this kind of age, when you go to the grocery store, my parents used to do this. It was so much fun. We would go through the aisles and we're buying stuff anyways. And so my mom, for example, would say, oh, we're going to buy this no name versus the brand name. Did you see the difference? And I would do, oh, yeah, that looks smaller. And that's, you know, at a 5-year-old, oh, that number is maybe smaller if I had the cognitive ability to understand it. However, over time, I started appreciating what that actually meant, because my parents started connecting the money, why smaller might be better in some cases, and why paying more for something might be better in some cases. So reviewing the bill at grocery stores, using coupons or using deals. Maybe you have a MasterCard that gives you points, explaining that. Another thing at this age, they really should have some type of banking account by now. It doesn't matter which account, savings account or checking account, what bank you go with, or what, like if it's with online brokerage or a physical one. What's more importantly is that they have their own. And speaking of which, well before here, they should have their own library card too. And we'll talk about how the library can really play in this in a moment. In the mall, this is a good time to show needs and wants. And as an example, when you're going window shopping, I know a lot of adults who have fun going window shopping and they leave it at that, and other adults who go window shopping and then they end up buying the store. And so similarly with children, you can use this opportunity to go through the Lego store as a great example for kids at this age, and showing how what are needs versus wants. You're going past the Lego store, you're going past the grocery store. Now, I'm not saying to be miserly with your children, don't buy them anything, of course not. Instead is, as you do activities throughout the year, you go to a park versus to Wonderland. You go to the library versus going to camp. It's these opportunities where you can really instill these values of needs versus wants. Restaurant and cooking at home, I gave that as an example earlier. Once again, restaurants are a great thing. We're all very glad that the restrictions, you're allowed to eat at a patio. I certainly have gone to a couple already. But the idea that you can't go to a restaurant every day, it just wouldn't be financially feasible. And understanding though, not only just the financial literacy between going to restaurants versus cooking at home, but importantly, and this is another way you can tie in pedagogy, is the health implications of eating out a lot versus cooking at home. And then lastly, a third layer is sustaining whatever culture you're a part of through cooking versus eating out. And lastly, I thought this was a great idea in some of the books that I've read. And again, I'll have a list of books at the end of the presentation for you to peruse. But this was such an awesome idea where at this age, let's say about 8, you tell your child, okay, we have $200, and you give them that budget for their own birthday party, assuming that the restrictions are over. And you invite as many kids as you want, we'll pretend 10, for example, and you let them decide what kind of party do you want. We have $200, so we can do a pool party. We can go to a Wonderland as an example. We can do a barbecue, et cetera, and it gives them, again, buy-in. They're actually making decisions. So you've created the budget so they can't go over. However, they feel the autonomy of, this is what money gives you. It's not a matter of happiness, it's about choice. And when they start putting in those connections, especially at these ages, this is where it becomes very powerful and compounds, just like investments, it compounds their financial literacy over time. So another thing to keep in mind about consumer habits via the library. Of course, as I said earlier, you're not going to be miserly with your children. We all want the best for them. But what we want to do is to shift where to get certain resources. And in the case of video games, books, and movies, and music for that matter, it's all through the library. I've seen many, many parents, hundreds of them in my years at Vaughan Public Libraries, we're going to take out as many video games as you want, but you only get 3 weeks with them. And this teaches them patience. It teaches them time allocation because you can pause your holds, books. And then when time comes for their birthday or a holiday, that's when they get those all-time video games, the books that they just absolutely adore, and the movies that they want to rewatch and rewatch. So speaking of the library, I mentioned this in the previous session. I think it's really poignant to do it here again in a slightly different version. Something to keep in mind, you are a shareholder of the library with your library card, and you're going to leverage the library because you're going to save a lot. I mentioned last month that I have been using Vaughan Public Libraries for 5 years, and I've averaged $6,000 saved every year. So I take out a lot of books and games, and when you add that up, that really is substantial. And remember, I'm just one person. If you have a family of 4, that number can be really big. And we have people who take out hundreds of items every month, and that can add up tremendously. Leverage our free information. So I will send you again a list of books to look at, and that will be really useful for you, not only teaching your kids, but just in general. We talked about sort of using the library as a means to create patience and cultivate a sense of community, in that the library is a great place to use before you end up buying. So take out the book. Read it together. If it becomes something that they just can't live without, then you can buy it. But I promise you, if you take out hundreds of books, there won't be hundreds of books you'll be buying. You might buy a handful instead. Similarly with patience, if you get used to using the library, you'll get used to getting profits. And specifically what I mean is I have so many things on hold, and when they come in, even if I wanted to play that newest game or read that newest book, by the time it actually comes in, I will have already had so many things to read and busy myself with that waiting, it doesn't become an issue. And this is especially poignant at the age of, I was talking about 5 to 8. You really set the limits of what's worthwhile. They'll really emulate you. And if you're a heavy library user, they too will become a heavy library user because you're showcasing them the power of the library. And slowing down and appreciating the journey. I think this is even more poignant and palpable to you as a family when you're doing this together. It's so great to see, COVID with the exception, but it's so great to see all these families come to the library and use it in various ways. You know, their teenagers will go off into the teen section, the children will go in the children's section, the adults will be getting their own books, and then they come together as a family and explore the library and all our resources. It's great to see. Another thing to keep in mind, as far as you might not have known, but I think it's worth talking about, that the library has an incredible amount of free resources. So of course, books, movies, TV shows, video games, a lot of people don't know about that. We have Switch games, PlayStation 5 games, Xbox One games, music, ebooks, e-audio, newspapers and magazines in many, many languages. And we have streaming services for movies. You can take out iPads, MiFis, GoPros, GPS. Once COVID has subsided, you'll be able to go back into our green room and recording studio for free. And this is a great place where, as an example, for children, we've had children who take piano lessons and they do it in the recording studio because there is a keyboard there. So they'll meet their teacher there. They have a couple of hours in the recording studio. Again, it's free with your library card, and then they'll practice at home. It's a great way to really use the library. Something to keep in mind too, especially with the summer, is we have a ton of free programs for teenagers and children, including the Summer Reading Club, Teen Summer Challenge, and many, many STEAM activities. If you haven't already, be sure to look at our What's On, which it comes out online, and have a look at that. There is a ton of stuff, and all for free. And then quickly, we have lots of research databases that you can see there. And lastly, for the summer, we've introduced Ontario Park Passes. You can go to one of the 3 resource libraries, but be sure to call ahead. And you can pick up a free Ontario Pass that allows you and your family to go to one of the Ontario parks for free. We also have what's really cool, nature backpacks, which include a backpack, of course, as well as materials like maps, magnifying glasses, animal charts for exploring your neighborhood. Again, shifting the activities you do as a family, not exclusively to free things, but really utilizing what is already available to you. And so you're getting all the financial, you're enjoying everything you were already enjoying without the financial costs, and you're avoiding the deprivation of just doing nothing. And so lastly about this is I want to highlight that when you reframe, and this is more for the adults than children, when you reframe that money is a representation, when you get a wage, you get your paycheck, that's past time, that represents past time. Your present time is full of opportunity costs. So for example, when you decide we're gonna eat out today, that money, we'll say it's $50, that $50 opportunity cost is now gone. Because you spent 50 on food, that's 50 that you couldn't have invested, or that's 50 you couldn't have given away as a charity, or that's 50 you couldn't have done something else with it. And lastly, future time is really represented by debt. When you own debt, let's say on your house or a car, you are contractually obligated to whatever that 30-year mortgage is. That's a representation of 30 years of labor that you've signed away and partitioned to that specific thing. Again, debt's not a bad thing necessarily. We all have to live somewhere and drive places. But if you start thinking of money in these terms of through time, as I've put here, past, present, and future, it might give you an easier way to make harder decisions about how you spend your money, and thus how you spend time with your family. Okay, so now we're into years 9 to 12. As I talked about, we have a tendency in North America to raise consumers rather than conscious, fulfilled adults. Something that the library really helps you do is make your child, and now they're getting to the tween years, as actual consumer of ideas, getting excited about ideas, meeting friends at the library, or in the case right now for digital programs, meeting digital friends and connecting with others. Becoming consumer of ideas gets them much more excited overall than consumers in the traditional sense. Another thing at this kind of age is when they start really understanding, because of trends, that they start gravitating to wearing the best clothes and showing off at school, as an example. But instilling this idea of using things and loving people, not the other way around. This is the age where it starts becoming palpable for you to, as I was saying, use the libraries, use the community version of money as time to inculcate these better ideas that will, again, compound as they get older. The delayed gratification and financial goals with the library, this is a big one. Hopefully by this age, they're starting to understand that, and I understand it's quite difficult between tweens and teens about delayed gratification, but if you start inculcating at the beginning with getting them the buy-in, so every year you're putting in the max for your RESP, you're showing the child, this is how much money you have. I would even say at 6 years old, because it's their money for education, you're using the RSP as an example that this is your money and eventually you'll be using it for school. And so as such, they really have buy-in and they can start understanding of, by putting the money in this account, it's gonna grow without us touching it. When they have that in the back of their mind, it'll be a lot easier for you, whether you're giving them an allowance or what have you, for them to start connecting of their everyday spending to their real future. Now they're at the age too where they might be interested of sort of entrepreneurship. And this is a good time. And this, again, all of these suggestions are really up to you of whether you implement them or not, or at what age. But this is certainly the time where they can start doing stuff to earn some petty cash. So for example, babysitting, once they're getting ready to hit 13, buying something and selling. I mean, a good example is buying lemons, making lemonade stands, or I've heard of a lot of kids buying candy and then selling it, whether at school or different events. Again, without COVID restrictions, this is the perfect time for chores where you're giving them money potentially for chores, or you're giving a lump sum every week to perform chores. Here's a controversial suggestion. I saw this, a couple parents did this. I thought this was really compelling at the library. They would go into the library and they would give the child 1 cent per page they read. And so the child sometimes would easily read the junior easy. They're 8 years old and they would read the junior easy. No. You have to read chapter books. And more importantly, let's say they take out one of the Harry Potters, which is 700 pages. So $7 by the end of the reading it, but then they would have them write a paragraph or two in reflection of it, and then they would pay them. This is, again, completely optional. I found this compelling for 2 reasons. One, it really did force the readers who are very reluctant to read, because it gave them another avenue of why reading is important, in that case, earning money. But secondly, eventually it got to a point where they were just reading and they didn't care about the money, because as they got older, they stopped paying 1 cent per page and it just became a habit. Another thing, a couple other stuff at this age of the 9 to 12 is inculcating gratitude and avoiding being spoiled. So a lot of the books, and again, the list will be available to you at the end of the session. A lot of these books talk about, it doesn't matter how much money you earn as a parent, you could be in the top 1%, you could be in the bottom 20%. But spoiled is more about your relationship with your child and how you use money as a tool. Do you use it to get them to stop talking, as an example, when they're really frustrated, or are you using money as opportunities? So a part of inculcating gratitude is not only getting them to say thank you and what have you, but understanding, again, where does that money come from, which is a conversation, multiple conversations you'll give them over time, but explaining that labor behind what you're doing. Again, I talked about family working together with the shared goal. So the shared goal could be, for example, in 1 month, we want to do a fun trip. We want to do a road trip, but we want to, and you can set an arbitrary amount of money, but still do activities, as an example. Again, using the library to fix problems. A lot of people, we use money to fix a problem. Something doesn't work, I'll just buy a new one. Or I want this information now, I'll just buy it online. And using the library, first and foremost, to try to fix those type of problems, if possible, will help you not only save a lot of money, but more importantly, you'll showcase to your child how the library is a true resource for them. Another thing at this age that is important to keep in mind is you'll hopefully start teaching them about partitioning. Of course, kids are going to spend money. They're going to want candy. They want to go out with their friends. That's definitely part of the childhood experience and something we should all recommend. But you're also going to want to start showing, again, with your RESP, is showing them how investing can work. Would you rather buy something now or wait a couple years and have even more? Or even better, your money could sustain itself by paying you every month or every quarter or every year, and you can live off your money. And if you get them into that kind of mindset earlier than later, it will really pay off dividends. And so, you can see here, I put including them in the RESP decision process. I don't mean they're picking stocks for you or indexes or what have you, but rather you're showing them, you're really giving them buy-in on this is your money that you'll spend eventually for your education. And so it's a great thing that they can grow with. And as they get older, they too can see the power of compounding. So here I want to bring up, because we're at the age 9 to 12, I kind of talked about allowance. I want to reframe these ideas just a little bit. So hopefully this alternative perspective can give you some alternative strategies for this. So of course you're going to pay for your child's food and your clothes, and they want something, you're going to buy it. A couple of ways you can think about allowance. You can think of it as a universal basic income. And what I mean is it gives them very hard limits. So let's pretend, just as an example, you give them $10 a week, just as an example. They're 12 years old, they get $10 a week, and they can do whatever they want for it. And if they want anything more, they have to either do chores, which is the most likely scenario, or they can get some type of side gig, or you're helping them, they buy candy and they sell it for a profit, for example. That's one thing to think, how to think about allowance. Secondly, sort of dividends. This is an interesting one that some books, and I've seen at the library with talking to parents. Some parents, what they'll do is, because they've inculcated, again, a very saving mentality with their child, whatever money the child gets, so from a birthday or for a holiday, what the child will do is they'll spend half of it, as an example, and then they'll put the other half in their in a savings account that they've already opened. Something that you can encourage, if you want to encourage your child to save, is that you can match their savings. That's one way you can incentivize them. So pretend, for example, they get $100 for school for their birthday. You could say to your child, if you save whatever you end up saving, let's say 50, I'll match that with you. And so you'll get 100. And that will really incentivize them, showing them explicitly of course, that's fake compounding because you're matching. But if you think back to the RESP, that's what the government does. And so lastly, I just put 50% arbitrarily. That's really up to their comfort level and yours for that matter. But 50%, especially at that age, they have no expenses, is very realistic for whatever they might earn. Okay, now we're really talking about the ages where they can start really making decisions. So ideally, once they're 15, if not earlier, depending on the industry, they're getting some type of part-time job. I started working, funny enough, I had an interview the day I turned 15 with the city of Brampton in maintenance at a rec center. And I did that for 10 years. That put me through school, of course. And I learned a lot of sort of financial literacy because I had real skin in the game. I really figured out through mind and muscle, whoa, working can be quite tiring. And I came to really appreciate the money I was working for. So something similar at that age, that's a great age for them to really start getting buy-in they start really connecting. You've talked in the abstract up until this point about how money is produced. When we buy something, this is our labor that came into it, or even if your money made money, this was past labor. So this is a great way to not only get them the skin in the game, but hopefully start introducing to what they might like. And we'll talk about that a little later. Learning soft skills at this age, 13 to 17, they're definitely a teenager by then. They definitely want to go with the crowd for the most part. They want to buy whatever the latest trend is. And one of the books that I suggested actually teaches tweens how to resist that. More on that later. And so learning soft skills about managing their time, because if they have a part-time job, not only do they get money and experience, but they'll really have to become quite poignant and proficient with how they're managing school time and their friends and their family and their jobs. And just as an anecdotal evidence, we have some CAs at our library who are high school students, and I can see this with my own eyes of how these teenagers become so sharp with the way they partition their time. It's very impressive. And most importantly, they come to realize what they really want to do and what actually makes them happy. Understanding a paycheck, that's another benefit of getting a part-time job, is they can really, again, appreciate, oh, the government takes off a certain percentage of what you make, and this goes to EI and CPP, yada, yada. Here's another very controversial suggestion. There's lots of, so I talked about earlier about paying per page or paying per book. There are some parents who pay for grades. So if they hit a certain grade, let's say they get an A, a parent will give them $50 in a subject. Or if they get an A+, they'll pay them $100, what have you. Something to keep in mind if you end up using this strategy, which I'm all for if it really helps them study, because that is how eventually when they go to work doing really well, there's an incentive there. Just importantly to keep in mind is that you want to, over time, align incentives with your core values, whether it's you as a family or what you want your child to really value. Do you want your child to really value the time with family and having the opportunity to do as they please? Or do you want your child to get to a financial point where they're very comfortable? So something to keep in mind. And of course, at this age, 13 to 17, this is where you're really starting to explore career options, not only with a part-time job, but just in general with their likes and strengths. And this is important. There's a lot of evidence about really investing on what the child likes. So I'll give you an example, just anecdotally mine is I love video games, I liked reading, so forth. And so I did really well in music and English. When I went to university, I, however, started in computer science because, again, the video games. But after a year and a half, I decided, I couldn't envision myself. I was doing fairly well, but I couldn't envision myself, no matter how lucrative this profession is, to do this for another 30 years. And so I ended up switching to English. I got a master's in English, then I got a master's in library science. And here I am today teaching you about money and using the library. And so most importantly is being flexible with sort of the explorations, but even better is if I had tuned in high school that I really enjoy English and connecting with people. And so I should look up then a career that rather than just picking a career that could be lucrative in the future. So now theoretically they're 18 or older. And if you can see on your screen on the left side, this is approximate that if you were to have done that full 50,000, I just put 3,000 a year. You invested 3,000 a year in their first year, all the way up until they're 17, 3,000 a year, and your portfolio averaged 9%. After 17 years, that portfolio would be worth just under $111,000. That will certainly get them through most of university. Granted, by then inflation will be higher, but that gives you a really good idea of the real compounding effects, the magic of compound interest. Of course, it could be a little lower, a little higher. Something to keep in mind, you can see on the right side of your screen where you can see the first column shows the year, 1 to 17. And the second column shows how much you put in per year, 3,000, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third column shows how much your book value, so how much you put in. And the last column shows how much the market value, how much it's grown. So first year is 3,000, then it's 6,270, then 9,834. And so I put all these numbers here because you're going to want to show your child as they grow every year by year to show them, look how important putting away money, seeing it grow by itself. It gets to a point, hopefully, I mean, that's what pensions do, is you work to a point where your money makes more money than you could possibly do at whatever you end up doing in your profession. And that's the ultimate goal. I mean, we all don't want to work forever. We eventually want to retire. And so that's the idea. Now imagine as a child to see something like this in real time via their RESP, get them involved. Again, they're not picking the things, but they can really see in real time, oh, if I diligently save and I can invest, I too, it might start shifting their priorities. Now, again, there'll still be teenagers or kids and still want things, of course. But most importantly, you're introducing these IRAs much earlier than when they're in university, which is typically when people learn about financial literacy, or even worse yet, when they actually start their job. And of course, something to keep in mind with that 110 or 111,000, 7,200 was from the government, and that 7,200 made 9% every year, or 500 every year times 17 years. We're coming to near the end. Now they're 18 and over. When they hit 18, you should immediately together open a tax-free savings account for them. This will be in their name. You can have it joint so you have control over it. That's completely up to you. Probably best at that age. But now it will become really exciting. Let's pretend they turn 18 in 2021. They'll have $6,000 they can put in. And all the gains, dividends, interest, et cetera, or return on capital, all that will be tax-free if you decide to take it out. However, by this age, if they were continuing on this journey with you with their RESP, they'll start to really internalize the power of compound interest and saving and investing. And I'm sure a lot of them, whether you use this for a car eventually, or just any type of purchase, or just saving to save, the tax-free savings account is something you should immediately open when they hit 18. Something to keep in mind too, at this age, if they go to university, college, or what have you, ideally they're working in the summer and potentially during school off times, not only for the money, but besides even that, building their resume. This is really important. And I want to stress this because perhaps 30 years ago, it was very easy to do a degree, whatever it was, and do a degree, graduate, and immediately get a job. Now, in contemporary society, that's just not enough. You have to have practical experience. And let me again, anecdotal evidence, but I'm going to use myself as an example. I talked about I had an English master's and I have a library science master's. With that being said, you can have all the degrees. Most people would say, don't take English. You can't get a job with that. And that might be true. But I realized when I was doing my master's degree in library science that I needed practical experience, not only because I wanted to understand beyond the theory of libraries, but more importantly, all of my colleagues who were at school, all my classmates, all of them had part-time jobs in the library. And I knew I just couldn't compete. I ended up volunteering at 4 hospital libraries, Sick Kids, Princess Margaret, Mount Sinai, and St. Michael's, in their libraries. And then I got a job. I was extremely lucky. I got a job with Vaughan before I even graduated. And only because I did volunteering because they were more impressed by my experience than my degree. And so that's another thing. I talked about having a part-time job. Volunteering is just as far as resumes go, just as valuable as making money. And that's something to keep in mind when they're trying to find the passion that they want to eventually pursue for the rest of their life or the rest of their working life. Volunteering is a good way of figuring what that might be. So another thing to keep in mind at this age is this is where really increasing investing literacy is key. And so we talk about money sense when they're 5 to 8 year old, or chores, connecting the labor with the monetary value, and then investing in general. When they're 18 and above, they're going to start getting into the thousands for expenses if they go to school, especially. And this is where, for me anyways, and for parents, what I've talked to, this is where the sort of the magnitude of their life decisions had huge financial impacts. So this is, don't think of it of, oh man, this is gonna be stressful because they're going to school. If you had followed some of these steps in addition to whatever you're implementing now, you should be well suited for the most part financially. It's more about inculcating, again, okay, now you're in the sort of the big leagues with money. And this is something that you and your child, or your almost adult by this point, can make these decisions together. Number 4, avoid debt with scholarships and leveraging investments. The idea is, firstly, there's lots of scholarships out there for many, many different sort of requirements. And more importantly, because I know that's not available to everyone, and you might have heard, oh, there's so many scholarships, but you can't find them. There are websites that distill, depending on where your child, or now your adult, going to school for, depending on not only what school, but what's your cultural background, what is they're going in for, what are their grades, what kind of volunteering they're doing. I know, for example, TD has had every year scholarships just for volunteering basis. And a lot of the library, I've written many, many letters for our library volunteers for scholarships like that. On the flip side, leveraging investments, again, their RESP should be by then fairly large relatively to their cost of school. But even, let's say, it doesn't match up to what school will end up costing, there are ways you can work around it. So for example, is it feasible for them to live at home and commute to school? Is it feasible to, okay, it's not, let's say, is it feasible for them to be with roommates? If not, is it feasible for them to, let's say, cut on their meal plan? You pack lunches, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I put here, spread the costs out. Remember that you're not paying for a university or college all at once. You're paying year by year. And if you think about, on average, investments can do about 9%. If you look at your RESP and any other money you have for your child, you're going to try to outweigh how much is the money growing compared to how much they're spending. And as far as the investing literacy goes, that previous point, this is a good time to really show your child the connection about, here's the big leagues of how money can eventually supplement your lifestyle. And lastly, I put investing in yourself pays the greatest dividends. I sort of use myself as an example, going to all those hospital libraries and really understanding stuff. That's really important because we can talk about money all day, but again, it's a tool, it's a means to an end. It's just a tool to living a fulfilled life, whatever that might mean. Of course, there are financial realities of you need to make a certain amount to be able to have these be able to make these fulsome decisions. But as I said, with me, I realized, I really like helping people. I like literacy in all its forms, and this is a great career path. And so investing in myself, reading lots of books, studying constantly, and then, of course, volunteering really helped me, or getting a part-time job in this space. And this can pay off over their career many, many folds. So lastly, for this slide, I put undergrad anywhere, they pay you. This, of course, again, with the scholarships, is not necessarily true, but in my experience with people I've tutored, as well as parents and in my family, it's undergrad is not as important whether the school you go to. It really isn't. The prestige of going to U of T compared to York or compared to Ryerson is really irrelevant. If you've learned anything, I hope, from this particular slide, is that the employers do not care necessarily about where you went or what your degree you have. Rather, what are the skills that you bring to the table? That's what the employer is looking for. So as such, if your child for example, applies to 5 different universities and 1 or 2 of them offers money, that might be the one to go to, because they should essentially learn the exact same skills whatever university they go up to. And I put grad school if applicable, because it's becoming more and more of a norm, but it's still not absolutely the necessary. It's really depending on their career. So I'm going to send everyone an email at the end of the presentation with all of this, so you don't have to write anything down. I've created a new list. It's called Teach Your Kids and Teens About Money. It's 10 books that we have at Vaughan Public Libraries for you to explore. A lot of them are for your children specifically to learn about. So there's a couple, one off the top of my head I remember is Needs versus Want. It's very plain language, it's very simple. We're talking grade 1 to 3 or so. It could skew higher or lower depending on your child's literacy, but it really starts giving them examples about what's a need versus a want. I have one as a pre-reader for 5-year-olds that is a lot of fun, talks about saving money and then buying a fun friend. Not a fine friend, a fun toy. Also something to leverage is that when the libraries, now that we're reopened to coming into the resource branches, you can do a search for personal finance books, not only for you, but for your child and teens. And we have a ton of them. I put the Dewey number as 332s. So this is really cool. And this is a new sort of wave of financial literacy. This is especially in the United States, but Canada too, is you might have heard of sort of the FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early. Whether you want to retire early or not, that's kind of irrelevant. More importantly is the financial independence, the financial literacy of it, of having enough money to live off of. And that doesn't mean you quit your job, but rather it's about inculcating enough money to be set, so forth. And so the guys who created the book and the podcast, Choose FI, they've done, this is a completely not-for-profit, it's completely free. They have some American schools starting to implement this. It's called the pre-K to 12 curriculum. And this pre-K to 12 curriculum goes through each age. So you can do this at home with your child as they grow up, or whatever the age they happen to be at. You can go through and they have lots of activities according to their age. And it teaches them financial literacy and all sorts. So we talked at the beginning of the session about the Ontario government talking about debt and mortgages. Why don't you start with saving, investing, learning money sense, opportunity costs. Then once they have a fulsome idea of that, you can talk about mortgages and when debt is appropriate. And this curriculum does it. It's an incredible resource. I will send you the link. I mentioned earlier about Rational Reminder and The Plain Bagel. These are great podcasts that your teenagers, I think they will be well suited, but any age really. Plain Bagel is a YouTube Canadian channel by a CPA from Ottawa. He explains great resources, things very plainly, different financial concepts, and Rational Reminder, again, is a really great resource. And then I mentioned this last month, but it bears repeating, that the CPA Canada has financial literacy resources for all ages too, which is really, really great. So that comes to the end of the presentation. I hope you've taken something away from this. Again, lots of different advice. You, as the parent, really have to decide what you prioritize and what you think is appropriate for your child, but don't underestimate them. And most importantly, have fun doing this together, because it is a blast. I can speak from anecdotal evidence with myself, and more importantly, the thousands of parents and kids I've interacted with the last 5 years at Vaughan Public Libraries. I can see these type of concepts, the way different parents teach them is really fantastic and can help your child succeed over time. So that's my email. Again, I will send an email. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can answer the questions. So I'm just looking at the chat now. So if you have any questions of what I've gone through, please type them in the chat now.
Hey, Lonnie, I think we have one that Maddie sent me. She was asking for resources on scholarships.
Yes, that's a great question. Do you know what I'll do is I'll link one in the email I'm going to send everyone soon. I will link to Canadian scholarships, a link that will allow you to find some. That's a great question. Let's see. Oh, I see Vanessa sent me a message. Investing tax deferred in the hands of the student, not fully tax free. There are There are rules as to when you must start saving to get government grant. Must be the year they turn 15. I'm not sure if you're talking about the RESP, but I'll use that as an example. The RSP, it's in their name, but the parent or the grandparent or someone related to them has complete sort of, they are the ones who directing the investment, obviously not a 5-year-old, but it acts like an RRSP in that money grows tax-free, dividends, capital gains, what have you. It's when you take that money out for them to use it for education, that's when it's a taxable event, not when it's sold or bought within the account. I hope that answers your question. Okay, is there any other questions? Give one last chance. You can type it in. Okay, I'll take your silence that all your questions have been answered, and I hope that you've learned something today. Again, I appreciate everyone joining us. I will send you that email later tonight or tomorrow morning, and it will have all what I've talked about, as well as, if you would like, I can share the slides too. But there will be a this has been recorded, and so this will be up on our YouTube that you can always look at again.